A child cried in a royal carriage. That was all. One frightened child, wailing at a palace gate in Madrid on the morning of May 2nd, 1808. And the crowd watching the royal departure became a mob, and the mob became an insurrection. And the insurrection became the 6-year wound that drained the First French Empire of 250,000 men and broke the greatest military machine the modern world had ever assembled. Napoleon Bonaparte had defeated Austria, Prussia, Russia, and every professional army in Europe. He commanded forces that contemporaries described as unstoppable. Historian Charles S. Dyle, in his authoritative study of the conflict, estimates French dead in Spain approaching 250,000, more than all of Napoleon's previous European campaigns combined, lost to a country he expected to pacify in weeks. At the moment, he launched his largest invasion in history, 600,000 men into Russia. Approximately 300,000 experienced veterans were permanently trapped in Spain. Unavailable as reserve, unavailable as reinforcement, available only for the endless bleeding of what he would come to call the Spanish ulcer. He called it that himself. And from exile on St. Helena, he admitted it destroyed him. But here's what historians have never fully resolved. Napoleon had predicted exactly this. In 1795, as a young general, he had written privately that a land war in Spain was unwinnable because of the popular resistance it would generate. He knew the terrain. He knew the people. Then, 13 years later, with Europe conquered and his judgment insulated by unbroken victory, he invaded anyway. Something happened to Napoleon's understanding of his own limits between 1795 and 1808. The archives document every decision he made. They never explain the one decision that mattered most. By the end of this video, 3 documented facts will reframe everything you think you know about Napoleon's greatest failure. The single battle in July 1808, fought by troops Napoleon publicly called the worst in Europe, that forced a change in French military law, making unauthorized surrender punishable by death. The king installed on Spain's throne who genuinely abolished the Inquisition and laid the conceptual foundation for the Prado Museum, and was hated so completely that his subjects invented an entire false personality for him, including an alcoholism he didn't possess, and the word the entire world now uses for irregular warfare, guerrilla, born in these mountains, in these years, from people who had never read a military manual and didn't need one, to understand how the man who had conquered Europe walked into the trap he had predicted. We need to go back to November 1807, and the moment a single demand set a continent on fire. The continental system was the most ambitious economic weapon any European ruler had ever attempted, and it had one fatal flaw. It required everyone to cooperate. Following the destruction of the combined French-Spanish fleet by Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar in October 1805, Napoleon had abandoned his long-held ambition to invade Britain across the English Channel. The Royal Navy made that impossible. So he pivoted to economic warfare, a strategy formalized through the Berlin Decree of November 21st, 1806, and expanded by the Milan Decree of December 17th, 1807. The continental system was designed to strangle British trade by forbidding every nation under French influence from conducting commerce with the British. Cut Britain off from European markets, the theory went, and her economy would collapse, her government would fall, and the war would end without another shot. The problem was geography, history, and one stubborn Atlantic-facing kingdom that had been England's closest ally since the 14th century. Portugal refused. The Portuguese economy depended on maritime trade and British protection. Compliance with Napoleon's decrees would have meant immediate economic ruin. When Napoleon demanded that Portugal close its ports to British shipping in the summer of 1807, The Portuguese government proved dilatory, then resistant, then simply immovable. Napoleon's response was characteristically decisive. He would remove the obstruction by force. He negotiated the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's deeply controversial prime minister. A man who had risen from relatively modest aristocratic origins through the patronage of King Charles IV and was widely held by contemporaries to owe his position partly to a romantic relationship with Queen Maria Luisa. Godoy was detested by the Spanish public, blamed for the economic malaise and the catastrophe at Trafalgar, and desperate enough for Napoleon's favor to agree to a partition of Portugal in which he personally would receive the southern principality of Algarves. Under the treaty's terms, French troops would transit through Spain to subjugate Portugal. Spain would cooperate. Everyone would benefit. General Jean-Andoche Junot marched 25,000 to 30,000 French soldiers through Spanish territory in the autumn of 1807, navigating harsh conditions on roads that military historians have described as barely adequate for the passage of a large army. He captured Lisbon on November 30th, and the Portuguese royal family, escorted by the Royal Navy, sailed for Brazil. Not a capitulation, a relocation. The entire Portuguese monarchy transferred itself to its South American colony rather than accept French rule, taking the court, the treasury, and whatever they could carry across the Atlantic. It was an unprecedented act. It was also, though no one knew it at the time, a preview of how the peninsula would conduct the coming war, through absolute refusal to accept the terms Napoleon was offering. What happened next was the trap within the trap. Under the guise of reinforcing Junot's occupation and defending Portugal's coastline against British counter-invasion, Napoleon poured additional troops into northern Spain throughout early 1808. Eventually, between 60,000 and 100,000 French soldiers were inside Spanish territory, not as allies in transit, but as an army of occupation waiting for its orders. Napoleon's real objective had evolved beyond Portugal. Viewing the Spanish Bourbon dynasty as corrupt, politically unreliable, and strategically useless, he intended to remove it entirely and install a Bonaparte on the throne. The Spanish royal family, paralyzed by internal feuding and oblivious to the scale of what was approaching, would give him exactly the opening he needed. They were already destroying themselves from within. The Spanish royal family in 1808 was three people in open conflict: King Charles IV, a weak and politically passive monarch, his queen, Maria Luisa of Parma, and their eldest son, Crown Prince Ferdinand, who had spent his youth excluded from power and burning with resentment toward both his parents and the favorite they had elevated above him. Ferdinand had already been arrested in October 1807 for conspiring against his father and Godoy. He had submitted, been pardoned, and learned nothing except patience. When the full scale of the French military buildup in northern Spain became clear in March 1808, Godoy persuaded Charles to imitate the Portuguese royal family and prepare flight to South America. The royal court relocated to Aranjuez. On the night of March 17th, a Fernandista mob, supporters of the Crown Prince, stormed Godoy's palace. The Prime Minister was nearly lynched before being dragged to safety and arrested. Terrified, lacking any political resolve, Charles IV abdicated in favor of his son on March 19th. Ferdinand VII briefly ascended the Spanish throne. Napoleon refused to recognize the transition. He summoned both kings to Bailen, a French city just across the Pyrenees, ostensibly to mediate the dynastic dispute. Ferdinand traveled expecting validation of his kingship. What he walked into was a meticulously prepared legal trap. Napoleon coerced Ferdinand to abdicate in favor of his father, under the argument that the original abdication at Aranjuez had been extracted under duress from a mob. He then pressured Charles, who harbored a genuine and documented hatred for his son, to abdicate his own rights directly to Napoleon. The abdications of Bayonne, completed on May 5, 1808, transferred the Spanish crown to the Bonaparte through a process that had the form of legality and the substance of extortion. Ferdinand was sent to the Château de Valençay, the sprawling estate of Napoleon's former foreign minister Talleyrand, where he spent 6 years in comfortable, well-provisioned captivity. What he did there is documented in the historical record, and it is not heroic. While the Spanish people bled and died in his name, venerating him as El Deseado, the Desired One, a martyred symbol of national sovereignty, Ferdinand wrote obsequious letters to Napoleon expressing his unwavering loyalty, congratulated the French emperor on military victories against the Spanish forces fighting in his name, and petitioned at one point to be recognized as one of Napoleon's adoptive sons. British historian Michael Glover, in his assessment of Ferdinand's conduct at Valençay, concluded simply that the Spanish Bourbons never sank lower than this. On June 6, 1808, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain and the Indies. Joseph was a moderate, educated man, placed in an impossible position. He had previously served as King of Naples, where his record had been genuinely reformist. In Spain, he immediately began dismantling structures that had defined the country for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478, operating without interruption for 330 years, was abolished. Feudal privileges were canceled. Internal customs barriers were removed. The Napoleonic Code began its integration into Spanish law. In Madrid, Joseph ordered the demolition of cramped medieval streets and monasteries to create wide public boulevards and squares, earning the mildly affectionate nickname Pepe Plazuelas, Joe of the Squares, among some urban residents. The artworks seized from demolished religious institutions were consolidated into plans that would eventually, under later Spanish governments, become the conceptual foundation of the Prado Museum. A relentless propaganda campaign immediately made all of this invisible. Joseph was depicted as Pepe Botella, Joe Bottle, a severe alcoholic. The alcoholism was entirely fabricated. Contemporary documents confirm he did not have a drinking problem. His actual documented vice, maintaining visible romantic relationships with Spanish aristocratic women while his wife remained in France, was real, but insufficient for propaganda purposes. A false personality was more useful. The drunkard king, dissolute and contemptible, imposed by a foreign tyrant. The propaganda was brutally effective. Napoleon had fundamentally misjudged the depth of Spanish nationalism, the intensity of Catholic identity, the ferocity of regional pride, and the absolute unwillingness of the Spanish people to be governed by someone they hadn't chosen. He was about to discover what that unwillingness looked like when it stopped being passive. At the Royal Palace in Madrid on the morning of May 2nd, 1808, a crowd had gathered to watch the departure of the last members of the Spanish royal family for France. The city had been under French military occupation since late March. The crowd was sullen, resentful, and very large. What triggered what followed has been documented by witnesses on both sides. A young member of the royal household, the exact identity varies across accounts, cried out as the royal carriage prepared to move, frightened at leaving home. The sound broke something in the crowd. People surged forward to physically block the departure. French Imperial Guard grenadiers were already positioned at the gate. Murat, Napoleon's commander in Madrid, and his brother-in-law dispatched artillery to clear the crowd. When the guns fired, the protest became an insurrection. Street fighting erupted across the city. Poorly armed civilians, Historians documenting the uprising note they carried knives, axes, scissors, and whatever came to hand, attacked French cavalry in the Puerta del Sol and the surrounding streets. The French response was the deployment of their most intimidating available force, the Mamluk cavalry of the Imperial Guard. These were Egyptian fighters, Muslim, turbaned, wielding curved scimitars, whose visual strangeness in a Catholic city was not incidental. In Spain, where the memory of Moorish occupation had been woven into national identity for centuries, the sight of turbaned Muslim cavalry charging through the streets of Madrid was psychologically devastating in a way that transcended military calculation. Murat's proclamation to his troops that day has been preserved across multiple historical sources. The population of Madrid, led astray, has given itself to revolt and murder. French blood has flowed. It demands vengeance. All those arrested in the uprising, arms in hand, will be shot. The reprisals began before dawn on May 3rd. Hundreds of Spaniards were rounded up and executed at multiple locations around Madrid. Craftsmen found with the tools of their trade, sewing scissors, kitchen knives, shearing tools, were shot because the implements could theoretically serve as weapons. According to Wikipedia's documented account of the uprising, only a handful of French-speaking Madrileños avoided execution by being intelligible to their executioners. Francisco Goya was 62 years old and Spain's court painter. Whether he personally witnessed either the uprising or the reprisals on those 2 days is historically uncertain. The documentation, as art historians have established, does not confirm his presence. What is documented is that in February 1814, 6 years after the events, Goya petitioned the provisional government with a request to perpetuate, by means of his brush, the most notable and heroic actions of our glorious insurrection against the tyrant of Europe. The petition was granted. He produced 2 monumental canvases, the 2nd of May, 1808, and the 3rd of May, 1808, both now in the Prado. The second painting, depicting a man in white with arms raised in a posture that art critics, including Kenneth Clark, have compared to the crucifixion, facing an anonymous firing squad, became one of the most powerful anti-war images in the history of Western art, and the acknowledged influence on Manet's execution of Maximilian half a century later. Goya also created The Disasters of War, 82 etchings documenting the conflict's brutality on all sides, created between 1810 and 1820. They were not published until 1863, 35 years after his death, because of their political explosiveness. What they document is not heroism and villainy arranged neatly on opposite sides. They document a cycle: French soldiers executing civilians, Spanish civilians executing French soldiers, bodies displayed as warnings, reprisals generating reprisals. The plate titled Lo Mismo, the same, shows a Spanish civilian raising an axe to decapitate a French soldier. The violence was not one-directional. The news from Madrid spread faster than French couriers could ride. In the small town of Móstoles, near Madrid, 2 mayors, Andrés Torrejón and Simón Hernández, received reports of the uprising and the executions and responded by signing a declaration of war, calling on all Spaniards to rise against the occupiers. It was a piece of paper from an administrative office in a minor town. It became the spark for a nationwide conflagration. Provincial juntas formed spontaneously across Spain. By May 30th, according to contemporary accounts, all Spain was in rebellion. The Franco-Spanish alliance that had sent a fleet to destruction at Trafalgar 3 years earlier was permanently shattered. Napoleon had expected pacification in weeks. What he had ignited would burn for 6 years and consume his empire in the process. Napoleon had constructed flying columns fast-moving combat forces, to pacify Spain's major centers of resistance before they could consolidate. One of these columns, commanded by General Pierre Dupont de l'Etang, was dispatched across the Sierra Morena Mountains and south through Andalusia toward the port of Cadiz, where a French naval squadron sat at the mercy of the Spanish. Dupont was a veteran of Austerlitz and Jena, an experienced professional commanding approximately 20,000 men. Though Napoleon-Empire.org notes that many of his troops were inexperienced new recruits rather than hardened veterans, Napoleon publicly dismissed the Spanish regular army as the worst in Europe and described the irregular forces as packs of bandits led by monks. When General Francisco Javier Castaños subsequently assembled the army of Andalusia, approximately 29,000 to 35,000 men, depending on the source, to counter Dupont's advance, the emperor's contempt remained entirely unrevised. This was a miscalculation whose consequences would rewrite French military law. Dupont sacked Córdoba on June 7th. The looting that followed enraged the population and generated precisely the guerrilla response that would eventually cut his supply lines. He retreated to Andújar on the Guadalquivir River and remained there. Indecisive, according to military historians who have analyzed his decisions, for nearly a month while Spanish forces gathered around him. His hesitation consumed the one commodity he couldn't recover: strategic momentum. Castaños executed a sophisticated maneuver. Pinning Dupont at Andújar with part of his force, he dispatched General Theodor von Rading, a Swiss-born officer who had spent his career in Spanish service, to cross the Guadalquivir at Menguibar and seize the town of Bailen. This placed Rading's force directly across the road connecting Dupont to Madrid, effectively trapping the French between two Spanish columns with their line of retreat severed. At approximately 3 in the morning on July 19, 1808, Dupont force-marched his troops toward Bailen and collided directly with Rading's forces descending from the opposite direction. What followed in the July Andalusian heat, Spanish sources from the Jaén Paraíso interior archive document temperatures that rendered the engagement physically punishing before tactics had decided anything, was a prolonged, desperate French attempt to break through. Dupont launched 3 charges against Rading's line. All 3 were repulsed by steady Spanish artillery and infantry fire. Dupont himself was wounded. His army, dehydrated and without water resupply, was beginning to disintegrate. An extraordinary detail emerges from the battle's documentation. Some of the Swiss troops serving under Dupont defected to Rading's side mid-engagement. Rading, himself Swiss-born, commanding troops from the same cultural tradition, created a loyalty fracture that the French command had not anticipated and could not address. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, Dupont requested a ceasefire and entered surrender negotiations. What followed became one of the most consequential military decisions of the Napoleonic era. In the capitulation signed on July 22nd, Dupont surrendered not only his own force, but also General Videl's division, even though Videl's troops were outside the Spanish encirclement with a viable escape route. According to Wikipedia's account citing multiple military histories, approximately 17,000 men entered Spanish captivity, making Bailen the worst single defeat the French suffered in the entire Peninsular War. French battle casualties ran to approximately 1,800 to 2,600 dead. Spanish casualties, according to a Spanish historian cited in Web Hispania, drawing on documents from the National Historical Archive, totaled approximately 192 dead, 664 wounded, and 1,013 missing. The Eagle Standards, the sacred regimental flags that French soldiers were expected to die defending, were surrendered along with the men. 2 documented exchanges define the battle's aftermath. Handing the broader institutional consequence is documented in Wikipedia's account. An imperial decree dated May 1st, 1812, nearly 4 years after Bailen, declared every unauthorized surrender by a field commander a criminal act punishable by death. One battle produced a permanent change in French military law. The prisoner's fate deserves its own accounting. The Spanish had promised repatriation to France. Britain convinced Spain to renege. The approximately 17,000 French prisoners were confined on the barren, waterless island of Cabrera in the Mediterranean, an island with insufficient food, water, shelter, and medical facilities. Thousands died of malnutrition, disease, and exposure. It was a war crime on the Allied side, documented and largely forgotten. Joseph Bonaparte fled Madrid immediately upon receiving news of Bailen. The entire French military presence in Spain sheltered behind the Ebro River. Across Europe, in the courts of Austria and Prussia and Russia, something new was being experienced. The understanding that Napoleon's armies could surrender. The myth of inevitable French victory in open battle, the psychological foundation of French strategic dominance, had cracked. The word did not exist before this war. Guerrilla, meaning little war in Spanish, was coined in these mountains in these years to describe something that the professional military establishments of Europe had no category for and no doctrine to counter. It is now in every military manual on earth. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist whose work On War, published posthumously in 1832, remains foundational to modern military thinking, analyzed the Spanish insurgency while developing his concept of the people in arms and the theory of total war. The intellectual framework that underlies contemporary counterinsurgency doctrine was built partly on what happened in Spain between 1808 and 1814. What happened was a paradigm shift in the fundamental nature of war. Napoleon had constructed the finest conventional military force in European history, an army optimized for decisive battle, capable of concentrating overwhelming force at the critical point with speed that no 18th century military tradition could match. Against professional European armies that accepted the existing logic of warfare, this was nearly unstoppable. The Spanish insurgency rejected the logic entirely. The operational doctrine the guerrillas developed was rooted in what they had instead of what they lacked. They lacked artillery, cavalry, professional training, and the organizational depth to sustain pitched engagements against French veterans. They possessed complete mastery of local topography, the active cooperation of the civilian population, unlimited time, and the absolute refusal to accept that losing battles meant losing the war. French officers, in memoirs and dispatches quoted in the reference document for this script, described facing invisible enemies who were never where the French were looking. Fighters who would execute a devastating ambush from a rocky mountain pass and vanish into the civilian population before French reinforcements arrived. The intelligence asymmetry this created was strategically decisive in ways that pure battle outcomes cannot capture. Guerrilla fighters were embedded within and sustained by local communities. They received real-time intelligence about French movements, troop strengths, and supply routes from an entire civilian population, with every personal reason to provide accurate information. The French, conversely, were functionally blind. Guerrilla bands systematically intercepted French dispatch riders, meaning that Napoleon's orders, already based on information that was often weeks out of date by the time it reached Paris, frequently never reached the marshals they were intended for. Adjacent French armies commanding neighboring provinces sometimes had no idea what the other was doing, because the communication between them had been cut by people with knives and local knowledge. The manpower trap this created is documented in military history scholarship, cited across multiple sources in the research for this script. Out of approximately 350,000 French soldiers deployed to the peninsula at the war's height, historians estimate that up to 200,000 were permanently occupied in garrison duty, supply escort, and anti-partisan operations, not fighting Wellington's professional army, not engaging in the conventional campaigns that French doctrine was designed for, but slowly bleeding away in the mountains and valleys of a country that refused to acknowledge it had been conquered. This meant the effective French combat force available for conventional operations was consistently and dramatically smaller than headline troop figures suggested. The feedback loop the French created through their response to the insurgency compounded the problem in ways their command structure never managed to analyze adequately. Reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding guerrillas created more guerrillas than they eliminated. Villages burned, religious institutions desecrated, civilians executed for possessing kitchen knives. Each French atrocity expanded the insurgency's base of recruitment and deepened the hatred that sustained it. Every French soldier who committed violence against a Spanish civilian in the name of pacification was, in practical terms, doing the insurgency's recruiting work for it. The word the Spanish gave the world was not just a term, it was a doctrine, a philosophy, and a warning that Napoleon's empire was never able to absorb. Within 2 years of the 2 de Mayo uprising, the chaotic improvisation of the early insurgency had evolved into something that European military theory had no framework to describe: irregular armies with the organizational sophistication of regular forces and the operational flexibility that regular forces could never achieve. The men who commanded these forces were not the rustic peasant fighters of popular mythology. Many were former regular army officers, educated administrators, or professionals who had chosen insurgency over occupation. The most formidable of them created parallel state structures, taxation systems, supply networks, intelligence apparatuses that operated in direct competition with the French military government. Francisco Espos y Mina earned his title El Rey Chiquito, the Little King, through documented dominion over the northern region of Navarre and Aragon, so complete that the French could barely move outside the heavily fortified walls of Pamplona or Zaragoza without encountering his operations. He had taken command of the Division de Navarra after his nephew Francisco Javier Mina, who had begun the guerrilla struggle in the north as a young student, was captured by the French in March 1810. What he built from that inheritance represents arguably the most sophisticated insurgent military organization of the 19th century. Espos y Mina's force eventually reached approximately 11,000 men, a number that required the logistical and administrative infrastructure of a small army to sustain. He solved this problem with characteristic pragmatism. He created a shadow taxation system levied on French merchandise transiting his territory. The occupying force was funding the insurgency against it. Weapons and supplies captured from ambushed French convoys supplemented this income. He maintained strict discipline, distinguishing his force from the opportunistic banditry that the chaos of war had inevitably produced elsewhere. In July 1810, he captured a man named Echevarria, a criminal using the war's disorder to conduct brigandage under the guise of resistance, executed him, and absorbed his 800 followers into his own disciplined ranks. The distinction between guerrilla and bandit was, for Espos y Mina, not philosophical but operational. Bandits alienated the civilian population whose support made everything else possible. His tactical method was a masterclass in economy of force. He maintained a vast civilian intelligence network providing real-time tracking of French movements. He called his scattered fighters together only for planned engagements on terrain of his choosing, ensuring numerical superiority at the point of contact. After each action, his men dispersed back into the agricultural population. Indistinguishable from the farmers and laborers, the French were simultaneously trying to extract food from. By late 1810, the reference document for this script notes that approximately 38,000 French troops were deployed solely attempting to neutralize Espos y Minas operations, a force that represented not a division of the Grande Armée available for conventional operations, but 38,000 men permanently committed to chasing shadows through mountain passes. Juan Martín Díaz, El Empecinado, the Undaunted, conducted his operations in Old Castile and the Tagus River Basin with a different strategic focus, severing the communication lines between Madrid and France. He had begun in 1808 by ambushing a single French courier. Over 6 years, he built to thousands of fighters and was eventually formally commissioned as a captain general in the Spanish regular army. His sustained interdiction of the Madrid-France communication axis made Napoleon's ability to coordinate strategy across the peninsula progressively more theoretical and less actual. Both men demonstrate the evolution the insurgency underwent from 1808 to 1814. From spontaneous, leaderless rage to structured military operations that complemented Wellington's conventional campaigns in ways that made both more effective than either could have been alone. Modern military doctrine calls this civil-military synergy. The Spanish insurgents and Wellington's army were practicing it 2 centuries before the concept had a name. Napoleon called him a mere sepoy general. The contempt was consistent, documented, and, given what followed, perhaps the most expensive military misjudgment of Napoleon's career. Arthur Wellesley was born on May 1st, 1769, in Dublin, to a family of the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy. He commissioned as an ensign in 1787, served early in the Flanders campaign of 1794, where he received his first lessons in what incompetent command produced, and then sailed for India, which is where Napoleon's dismissal begins to fall apart. India was not, as the sepoy general epithet implied, a theater of limited military education. It was 6 years of sustained operational command against enemies who were frequently more numerous, often better armed than colonial mythology suggested, and operating in terrain and climate that made European campaign conditions seem benign. The battle that defined his tactical understanding came on September 23, 1803 at Assaye during the Second Maratha War. Wellesley faced a Maratha army that military historians assess as approximately 5 times the size of his own force. He won through aggressive maneuver, personal courage that included having 2 horses shot under him, and a tactical concentration of force that he later described in terms suggesting it required significant improvisation under pressure. Wellington described Assaye in later years as the best battle I ever fought, harder fought and more brilliantly won, in his assessment, than Waterloo itself. What India taught him that no European campaign could replicate: logistics as the primary determinant of operational sustainability, the critical value of intelligence gathered through scouts and spies, the necessity of maintaining civilian goodwill through paid rather than forced requisitioning, and the management of Allied forces whose cooperation could not be compelled. All 4 of these lessons would prove decisive in the peninsula. He returned to England in 1806 as a national hero and briefly served as a Tory Member of Parliament. In June 1808, originally prepared for a campaign against Spanish colonies in South America, his force was redirected to Portugal. "My die is cast," he wrote before departing, a quote documented in Wellington biographical sources, including the Waterloo Association. "They may overwhelm me, but I don't think they will outmaneuver me, because I am not afraid of them, as everyone else seems to be." He landed at Mondego Bay on August 1st with 13,000 to 15,000 men. 16 days later, at the Battle of Rolisa, his force engaged and defeated a smaller French delaying force in the war's first British engagement. 4 days after that, at Vitoria, he perfected a tactic that would define the next 6 years of warfare in the peninsula: the reverse slope defense. The principle was elegant and devastating. French offensive doctrine relied on massed infantry advancing in column, formations that generated psychological shock and momentum, but brought relatively few muskets to bear simultaneously at the front. These columns were typically preceded by heavy artillery bombardment to break enemy morale before contact. Wellington's answer was to position his infantry just behind the crest of available ridge lines, shielding them from French artillery fire they literally could not see. As French columns crested the rise, they encountered not broken, demoralized troops, but two-rank British lines deployed to maximize every musket, delivering concentrated fire at close range into formations that could only respond with their foremost ranks. The column, which had been an asset against European armies that deployed predictably in the open, became a liability against an enemy it could neither see nor suppress. The victory at Vitoria was almost immediately squandered. Not by Wellington, but by the generals who superseded his command and negotiated the Convention of Sintra, which allowed the defeated French army to be evacuated back to France on Royal Navy ships with all their equipment and whatever they had looted from Portugal. The public outrage in Britain was genuine and intense. A formal inquiry was convened. Wellington was the only senior commander fully exonerated, and the inquiry that should have ended his career instead secured him sole command of British forces in the peninsula. He returned to Portugal in April 1809 with 28,000 British and 16,000 Portuguese troops. The French army of Spain numbered 360,000. He would not be overwhelmed. He would instead build something in the hills north of Lisbon that would change the character of the war entirely. In October 1809, Wellington issued orders to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Fletcher of the Royal Engineers and Portuguese Major José Maria das Neves Costa to begin construction of a defensive system north of Lisbon. The orders were precise, comprehensive, and classified to a degree that military historians have described as remarkable for the period. The secrecy was so complete that, according to historyofwar.org's account, even some of Fletcher's own engineers reportedly did not understand the full scope of what they were building. The French intelligence apparatus received no information about the project for the entire 11 months of its construction. What they built, with approximately 150,000 Portuguese civilian laborers and militia supervised by British Royal Engineers, was the most extensive field fortification system of the Napoleonic Wars. 3 primary defensive lines stretched approximately 85 to 100 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean to the Tagus River, exploiting every natural feature of the rugged hill country north of Lisbon. The completed system comprised 152 forts, redoubts, and earthworks equipped with 600 artillery pieces. Valleys were artificially flooded through the construction of dams. Hillsides were scarped, deliberately cut to near vertical faces, to prevent infantry assault. Massive abatis of sharpened felled trees protected approaches. A telegraph communication system connected the forts, providing coordination capability that had no parallel in the conventional armies of the period. Roads were constructed between fortifications to allow rapid movement of reserves to any threatened point. The total cost, according to historyofwar.org, was £100,000, equivalent to the annual pay of approximately 5,500 infantrymen, less than a single division. Military historians studying the Napoleonic Wars have called the lines of Torres Vedras arguably the most cost-effective defensive system of the entire conflict. A judgment that becomes more comprehensible when measured against what it accomplished. The lines were only one dimension of Wellington's strategy. The other was systematic destruction. Before retreating behind the lines when the French advance came, Wellington ordered the evacuation of approximately 300,000 civilians from the territory the French army would cross, and the destruction of every resource that army might use to survive. Crops, livestock, mills, stores, shelter. The territory between the lines and the Spanish border would be a wasteland. A French army advancing through it would arrive having consumed its own supplies, with nothing available to replace them. Marshal André Massena led the French third invasion of Portugal in the summer of 1810. Napoleon had chosen him with deliberate calculation. Massena was his most trusted senior operational commander, a man whose Portuguese campaign planning document at the center of Portugal historical source notes included orders to throw the British Leopard into the sea. He commanded 65,000 men, the army of Portugal, and he advanced with the confidence of a general who had never been definitively stopped. On September 27, 1810, at the Battle of Busaco, Wellington positioned 52,000 troops along a 10-mile ridge in the Serra do Buchaco Mountains. Massena attacked. The French lost approximately 4,500 men. Allied casualties ran to approximately 1,250. Wellington then withdrew, strategically, not because he was beaten, but because Massena had found a route around the ridge. The French pursued, certain they were following a retreating army toward its final collapse. On October 11, 1810, the French vanguard reached the lines north of Lisbon and found something that wasn't in any intelligence report they had received. 4 days later, Massena himself came to inspect what his cavalry had encountered. He had marched 65,000 men through deliberately devastated countryside for weeks. He had expected Lisbon. He found 152 fortifications, 600 artillery pieces, and Wellington's army waiting behind them in positions that a frontal assault would simply fill with French dead. Massena's strategic position was perfect in its insolubility. Every option available to him led to the same outcome, merely at different speeds. He could assault the lines, the interlocking fields of fire, the scarped hillsides, the flooded valleys channeling any approach into concentrated artillery kill zones. historyofwar.org documents that the French launched exactly 2 skirmishes against the outer defenses at Sobral on October 12th and 14th, 1810. Both minor, both repulsed. After that, even Massena, who had not built his reputation through excessive caution, recognized that a full assault would annihilate his army against prepared positions before it reached Wellington's main force. He could not attack. He could not be supplied. The scorched earth policy had stripped the surrounding territory of everything a besieging army needed to sustain itself. His supply lines running back through Portugal to Spain were interdicted by Portuguese militia and guerrilla bands, who had every reason to attack isolated convoys and every advantage of local knowledge in doing so. The French army that was nominally besieging the lines was actually being besieged by its own logistics failure. He could not maneuver around them. The lines ran from the Atlantic to the Tagus. There was no flank to find, and he could not retreat without admitting to Napoleon, who had sent his finest operational commander with the expectation of decisive success, that 65,000 of the Empire's best soldiers had been stopped by earthworks they couldn't even attack. So Massena waited. He pulled his main force back to Santarém and established a winter position, hoping that Wellington would be forced by political pressure from London to advance and fight in the open. Wellington, who had spent considerable energy managing the political pressure from London that his strategy generated, refused. He maintained his position behind the lines and allowed the mathematics of starvation to do what he did not need to risk his army to accomplish. The human cost of the stalemate accumulated through the winter of 1810 to 1811. The French army had entered Portugal with 65,000 men. According to Wikipedia's account of the Torres Vedras campaign, Massena lost a further 21,000 men during the stalemate and subsequent retreat. The vast majority not in battle, but to starvation, disease, and exposure during one of the coldest winters the Iberian Peninsula had experienced in documented memory. These were not casualties from combat. They were the consequence of a supply system that had failed completely in terrain deliberately stripped of everything it might have consumed. Wellington had simultaneously created a civilian tragedy he had not fully anticipated. Approximately 300,000 Portuguese civilians had been evacuated behind the lines. Historyofwar.org notes that approximately 40,000 people are reported to have died around Lisbon during the winter from disease and deprivation. A figure that, while drawing on a single source and warranting appropriate uncertainty, suggests the scorched earth policy's human cost was not borne exclusively by the French. Wellington had underestimated Massena's capacity to forage even in near-desolate countryside. The French held at Santarém until March 1811, 5 months rather than the few days Wellington's calculation had suggested. In March 1811, Massena ordered the retreat. The army of Portugal, which had entered Portugal as the empire's finest invasion force, under Napoleon's most trusted operational commander, with explicit instructions to drive the British into the sea, withdrew towards Spain as a broken formation, leaving its sick behind, abandoning its equipment, carrying its dead in casualty figures that represented the destruction of a major French field army without a decisive conventional battle having been fought. Napoleon removed Massena from command of the Army of Portugal after the Portuguese failure. The French never mounted another serious invasion of Portugal. Wellington's secure base of operations, protected by the lines, supplied by the Royal Navy through Lisbon's port, staffed by British and Portuguese troops who had spent the winter training rather than starving, was permanently established. The war in Spain was about to become a different kind of conflict. Wellington had survived by defense and engineering. The question the next 2 years would answer was whether he could destroy. By the summer of 1812, the character of the Peninsular War had shifted. The lines of Torres Vedras had secured Portugal. The guerrilla insurgency had permanently degraded French operational capacity across Spain. Wellington had captured the key border fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo in January and Badajoz between March and April, both at significant cost. The storming of Badajoz on April 6, 1812, produced Allied casualties of 4,670 killed or wounded from an attacking force of 27,000. After the city fell, Wellington's troops went on a 3-day rampage. Britannica, drawing on contemporary accounts, documents that approximately 200 to 300 civilians were killed or injured by Allied soldiers during the subsequent breakdown of discipline, while noting that some contemporary accounts suggested figures as high as 4,000, which modern research considers substantially overstated. Wellington erected a gallows and threatened capital punishment to restore order. A British officer present recorded observations that the National Army Museum preserves as documentation of what unrestricted military violence looked like when directed at civilians who had technically just been liberated. With the border secured, Wellington advanced into Spain with 48,600 men, British, Portuguese, and Spanish, to engage Marshal Auguste Marmont's Army of Portugal, approximately 50,000 strong. The two armies had been maneuvering through the hills south of Salamanca for days, a prolonged tactical chess match that contemporaries found agonizing and historians have found fascinating. As each commander probed for advantages neither could quite achieve against an opponent of comparable quality. On July 22, 1812, Wellington was watching Marmont's army through a telescope from a position that gave him observation of the entire French line. What he saw in the mid-afternoon was a gap. Marmont's leading division had advanced significantly ahead of the main French column during a lateral movement, creating a separation of approximately 1 mile between the vanguard and its supporting formations. The vanguard was isolated. It was a tactical error of the kind that experienced commanders recognize as rare, fleeting, and decisive if acted upon within the window it exists. Wellington's response was immediate. Various accounts, including the National Army Museum's record and the Age of Revolution timeline, describe him snapping his telescope shut and acting within minutes. He attacked with Thomas Picton's 3rd Division against the isolated French vanguard, simultaneously driving at the French center with the 4th and 5th Divisions, adding cavalry to exploit whatever broke. A bayonet charge from Picton's force shattered the vanguard. The cavalry drove through the gap. The French center crumbled. Within minutes, some accounts describing the decisive phase as taking approximately 40, though this timing should be understood as approximate rather than precisely documented. Marmont's army had fractured irreparably. French casualties at Salamanca ran to approximately 13,000 to 14,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Allied casualties were approximately 5,000 to 5,200. Marmont himself was severely wounded during the engagement. Wellington liberated Madrid on August 12, 1812, the first time the Spanish capital had been free of French occupation since 1808. One documented failure tempered the victory. Spanish troops under General Despana had been positioned to block the French retreat at the bridge at Alba de Tormes, the only available crossing. Despana, according to the Age of Revolution timeline, had withdrawn from the position without informing Wellington, allowing the retreating French formations to escape when they could have been trapped. The victory, already significant, could have been more decisive. But what Salamanca accomplished transcended its casualty count. Wellington, consistently characterized across European courts as a defensive specialist, a man who won by not losing, had demonstrated that he could identify and exploit an offensive opportunity with speed and violence of execution that matched anything Napoleon's marshals had produced. The reputation changed. So did the strategic calculation across Europe. To understand what Spain cost Napoleon's empire, the arithmetic requires a specific kind of attention, not the arithmetic of individual battles, the casualty ratios, the guns captured, the towns taken and retaken, but the arithmetic of strategic reserve. The forces that aren't engaged in any current battle but exist to respond to disasters when they occur. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled what military historians have called the largest military force in European history to that point, approximately 600,000 men, the Grande Armée, for the invasion of Russia. He crossed the Russian border on June 24th. The scale was unprecedented. The strategic logic was coherent, if aggressive. Tsar Alexander I had refused to continue enforcing the continental system, which was economically devastating Russia. Napoleon intended to force compliance through a decisive campaign. At precisely this moment, approximately 300,000 French veterans were permanently deployed in Spain and Portugal. This figure, cited consistently across Wikipedia's Napoleonic Wars article, Britannica's Peninsular War entry, and the open-learn academic source drawn on in the research for this script, represents the strategic reserve that did not exist when Napoleon marched into Russia. Not 300,000 men available for other duties who happened to be occupied in Spain. 300,000 men who were gone, consumed by the Spanish ulcer, unavailable for any purpose except the endless attrition of guerrilla war and Wellington's methodical campaigns. The parallelism between the two theaters was not coincidental. and military historians have increasingly noted it. The scorched earth policy that destroyed Massena's army in Portugal in 1810 to 1811, and the scorched earth policy that destroyed Napoleon's army in Russia in 1812, were occurring in the same operational period, applied by different defenders against the same basic French vulnerability. An army that lived off foraging in territory deliberately stripped of everything that could be foraged. General Mikhail Kutuzov, the Russian commander who implemented the Russian scorched earth strategy, was making a choice whose effectiveness had already been demonstrated in Portugal. Whether this was parallel development or conscious learning from the Portuguese example remains a question that historians have not definitively resolved. What is documented without dispute is the consequence. When the Grande Armée began its catastrophic retreat from Moscow in October and November 1812, destroyed not by battle but by cold, starvation, and the relentless harassment of Russian irregular forces, Napoleon had no reserve to draw upon. The veterans who might have stabilized the retreat, reinforced the garrison of Germany, or deterred the formation of the coalition that was already crystallizing, were dying in Spanish mountain passes and Andalusian plains. By some accounts cited in Open Learn's academic sources, French casualties in Spain by January 1809 already exceeded the total casualties of all Napoleon's previous European campaigns combined. The Spanish ulcer was not metaphorical. It was a wound that drained faster than the empire could replace what it lost. Napoleon himself, on St. Helena, identified the connection. "That unfortunate war destroyed me," he wrote, in a statement documented consistently across multiple independent sources, including the National Endowment for the Humanities article, the Napoleon.org academic site, and the Counterfire review of Ronald Fraser's study. "It divided my forces, multiplied my obligations, undermined my morale. All the circumstances of my disasters are bound up in that fatal knot." The fatal knot was not a rhetorical flourish. It was his analysis of the mechanism by which Spain had made everything else possible for his enemies. In the summer of 1813, Napoleon was stripping Spain of veterans it could not spare. Approximately 15,000 experienced French troops were recalled from the peninsula for the German campaign, according to the BritishBattles.com account of Vitoria. Even as Wellington was preparing the offensive that would permanently end French control of the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish ulcer and the Russian disaster were not separate events connected by coincidence. They were the two dimensions of a single strategic failure, draining from opposite ends of an empire that had never developed the structural capacity to fight two such wars simultaneously. Wellington spent the winter of 1812 to 1813 solving the problem that had constrained his previous campaigns: supply. He shifted his logistical base from Lisbon, which required long overland supply lines into Spain, to the northern port of Santander, dramatically shortening the distance between his army and the Royal Navy's support. When he advanced in May 1813 with 121,000 troops, 53,749 British, 39,608 Spanish, and 27,569 Portuguese, according to the military history fandom Wiki's documented figures. He advanced with an army better fed, better equipped, and more confident than any he had previously commanded. His operational maneuver to reach Vitoria was itself a masterpiece. While commanding a small central force as a strategic feint, Wellington dispatched General Sir Thomas Graham with the bulk of the army around the French right flank, crossing mountain terrain that French intelligence had dismissed as impassable for a large force. The French lost contact with Wellington's army for 4 full days, the guerrilla interdiction of their courier networks making this possible. And when they re-established it, they were already outflanked. King Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jean-Baptiste Jourdan fell back toward the town of Vitoria, pulling their forces into a defensive basin surrounded by mountains. Joseph's choice of defensive position was, in retrospect, deeply problematic. The Zadorra River ran north and west of the town, spanned by multiple bridges, none of which, according to NapoleonEmpire.org's account, were destroyed or seriously defended. The roads through Vitoria were clogged with the accumulated baggage of 6 years of occupation. Joseph's wardrobe, the army's treasury, 6 years of appropriated Spanish wealth loaded into hundreds of wagons that blocked troop movements and would eventually become the most dramatic spoils of war in the entire peninsular conflict. On June 21st, 1813, Wellington launched 4 simultaneous columns against the French position. General Hill attacked from the south. Graham's force struck from the north. 2 central columns under Wellington himself struck the French center and left. Thomas Picton's 3rd Division, the formation that had broken the French at Salamanca 11 months earlier, crashed through the French center. The French left crumbled under Graham's pressure. The French right, cut off from the road to France, had nowhere organized to retreat. What followed was less a battle than a dissolution. Joseph Bonaparte escaped in his carriage, barely, and then only by abandoning the carriage itself and continuing on horseback. French casualties ran to approximately 8,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Allied casualties were approximately 5,000. The captures that defined the victory went beyond soldiers. 151 to 152 artillery pieces, the largest single seizure of enemy artillery in the entire Peninsular War, documented consistently across Britannica, Wikipedia, and NapoleonEmpire.org, plus Joseph's entire treasury, 6 years of accumulated loot, personal standards, and the documentary record of a French administration that had ceased to exist. Wellington's pursuit was broken off prematurely, as Allied troops stopped to plunder the French baggage train with a thoroughness that military discipline should have prevented. Wellington himself, according to the BritishBattles.com account of the battle, recovered only 250,000 francs from what had been an enormous royal treasury. Among the items recovered from Joseph's baggage by the 14th Light Dragoons was a silver chamber pot belonging to the former King of Spain. The regiment adopted it as a trophy. Known to this day as the Emperor, it is still brought out on regimental guest nights and filled with champagne for the toasts. It is, in its way, the most appropriate monument to the Peninsular War that exists. A piece of domestic silver, undignified, slightly absurd, permanent. The strategic consequences of Vitoria moved faster than Wellington could ride. Tsar Alexander of Russia ordered a Te Deum to be sung in celebration. The first time in documented history that this honor had been extended for a foreign army's victory. The emperors of Russia and Austria both offered Wellington command of their armies. He declined both. Austria mobilized and formally declared war on France. The Sixth Coalition, the alliance that would ultimately invade France, defeat Napoleon at Leipzig in October 1813, and force his first abdication in April in 1814, crystallized around the news from Vitoria. Ludwig van Beethoven composed his Wellington's Victory, Opus 91, to commemorate the battle, premiering it in December 1813 on a program that also featured the premiere of his 7th Symphony. Joseph Bonaparte had lost his kingdom in an afternoon. He would eventually settle in Bordentown, New Jersey, where he died in 1844. The former King of Spain, in a small American town, as far from Madrid as it was possible to get. The numbers, as historian Charles S. Dial documents in his 2001 study, The Peninsular War, considered by scholars, including Oxford's Michael Howard, to be the leading modern single-volume account of the conflict, run toward 250,000 French dead. Wikipedia's Napoleonic Wars article cites at minimum 91,000 killed in action and 237,000 wounded in the peninsula. The OpenLearn academic source, drawing on military history scholarship, puts total French losses by 1814 at 240,000 men. all three frameworks agree on the essential character of the figure: catastrophic, unprecedented, and irreplaceable. The range matters and deserves acknowledgement. The variation between these estimates, from roughly 100,000 to approaching 250,000 dead, reflects the incomplete state of French military records from the period, the difficulty of separating combat deaths from disease deaths in the documentation that survived, and the genuine scholarly disagreement about methodology. What is not in dispute is the direction. France bled in Spain at a rate that had no parallel in Napoleon's previous campaigns and no adequate replacement mechanism in his administrative structures. A 2021 study of officer casualty records by Spanish military historians Jorge Planas Campos and Antonio Grajal de Blas offers a finding that, if it holds across broader analysis, fundamentally reframes the war's popular narrative. Based on documented officer losses, a category of casualty for which records are relatively complete compared to enlisted deaths, the study suggests that approximately 77% of French casualties in the Peninsular War were inflicted by Spanish regular forces or guerrillas, with approximately 23% attributable to Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army. The study's authors note this is based on officer records rather than total casualty counts, and the finding is still being analyzed against broader data sets. But even directionally, the implication is significant. Wellington, who receives the majority of the credit in English language history, may have inflicted less than a quarter of the damage. Spain did most of the killing. Spain rarely gets the credit. The financial cost extended the damage beyond manpower. The reference document for this script, drawing on military history scholarship, cites the first year of French occupation alone as consuming approximately 800 million francs from the imperial treasury. The strategic irony compounds the financial one. The continental system that was supposed to defeat Britain through trade isolation was demonstrably failing by the middle years of the war. British trade with Portugal, documented in the 1944 Review's account of the war, increased from £1 million in 1808 to £6 million in 1811. A six-fold increase during a period when Napoleon was theoretically enforcing a trade embargo. The war designed to economically strangle Britain had instead opened new Portuguese markets to British commerce, while consuming French financial reserves at a rate that contributed directly to the imperial bankruptcy of 1813 and 1814. Open Learn's academic source notes that by January 1809, French casualties in Spain had already exceeded the total casualties of all Napoleon's previous European campaigns combined. This is a figure that deserves to be absorbed slowly. 1 year, one country, more dead than the Italian campaigns, the Egyptian expedition, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, and every other Napoleonic victory combined. And the war had 5 more years to run. 60 major battles, 30 major sieges, 6 years of continuous warfare across 19 Spanish and 6 Portuguese provinces. More battles, more sieges, longer duration than any other Napoleonic conflict, according to Wikipedia's account. Of the 156 infantry regiments in the French army by the war's end, 84 had fought in the peninsula. The war in Spain was not a sideshow. It was the longest and most costly sustained military engagement of Napoleon's entire career inside the walls of Cadiz, the only city in continental Europe that would survive a siege by Napoleon's forces. A different war was being fought. Cadiz occupied a unique strategic and symbolic position. Situated on a narrow peninsula jutting into the Atlantic, its ancient stone walls had previously defeated Moorish armies and British naval bombardments. In early 1810, as French armies swept through Andalusia and Marshal Soult marched 70,000 men to complete the occupation of southern Spain, The Duke of Albuquerque executed a forced march with 10,000 Spanish regular troops, collecting additional forces along the route, and garrisoned Cadiz just days before the French arrived. The Royal Navy, commanding the surrounding sea lanes, maintained open supply lines. Soult's forces cut the city off from the mainland, but could not assault it. French artillery could bombard it, but not reduce it. For 31 months, from February 5th, 1810 to August 25th, 1812, the city sustained the siege. The French never broke through. Cadiz holds the documented distinction, according to the National Endowment for the Humanities article on the war, of being the only city in continental Europe to survive a siege by Napoleon's forces. Within those walls, in the only territory of Spain never subjected to French occupation, the Cortes of Cadiz, a revival of the traditional Spanish parliament, convened and drafted a document that would become one of the most influential constitutional texts of the 19th century. The Spanish Constitution of 1812 established a constitutional monarchy with a strictly limited executive power, checked by an annually elected parliament, equality before the law, freedom of contract, centralized administration, and the abolition of feudal privilege. It was drafted inside a besieged city by people fighting simultaneously to restore a king who had never shown a single liberal impulse. It became, in subsequent decades, the template for liberal constitutions across Europe and Latin America. Napoleon released Ferdinand VII from Valenciennes in December 1813, in a calculated move to destabilize the Cadiz government by restoring the monarch it claimed to represent. Ferdinand returned to Spain in March 1814 to popular celebration of remarkable intensity. El Deseado, the desired one, returning after 6 years of captivity, the living symbol of national resistance. Within weeks of his return, Ferdinand abrogated the Constitution of 1812, dismissed the Cortes, re-established absolute monarchy, and reinstated the Spanish Inquisition. The same institution that Joseph Bonaparte had abolished in 1808, founded in 1478, 330 years old at its first abolition, was restored by the king, for whose freedom 6 years of war had been fought. The liberals who had drafted the Constitution were imprisoned or driven into exile. The military officers who had commanded the guerrilla resistance found their careers subject to Ferdinand's suspicion rather than his gratitude. British historian Raymond Carr, in his study of 19th century Spain, described Ferdinand's restoration as inaugurating a period of reaction that would define Spanish politics for a century. The afrancesados, the Spanish collaborators with Joseph's regime, including many of the country's most capable administrators and intellectuals, fled Spain with the retreating French army. Their properties were confiscated. Ferdinand declared them traitors. The exact number who went into exile varies across historical sources, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 12,000. Among them was Francisco Goya, who had painted portraits of French rulers while privately documenting the war's atrocities in the prints that would not be published for another half-century. He left for France in 1824 at the age of 78 and died in Bordeaux 4 years later. The constitutional promise of Cadiz and the reactionary reality of Ferdinand's restoration together produced a century of Spanish civil conflict. The Carlist Wars between liberal and absolutist factions that the Constitution of 1812 had been specifically designed to prevent. The war that Spain won militarily, it lost politically within weeks of the victory being secured. Zaragoza was reduced to rubble before it surrendered. The city in northeastern Spain, Aragon's capital, a vital strategic position, had repulsed an initial French assault in the summer of 1808 under General Lefebvre Desnouettes. an embarrassment that elevated it to a symbol of national resistance. When the French returned in December 1808 under Marshals Moncey, Mortier, and eventually Jean Lannes, Napoleon's most aggressive and capable battlefield commander, they brought over 40,000 troops and a heavy siege artillery train. The breach of Zaragoza's walls in late January 1809 was not the end of the resistance. It was the beginning of something that military historians have compared, in its intensity and its costs, to the urban battles of the 20th century. French engineers used explosives to blow holes through the internal walls of adjoining buildings to advance room by room. Spanish snipers operated from rooftops, cellars, and church bell towers. The attrition rate among French technical officers managing the urban advance was catastrophic. They were the men directing the dangerous work of creating breaches, and they were specifically targeted. Lannes himself, the marshal who had crushed the Spanish at Tudela, one of Napoleon's oldest and most trusted commanders, became so enraged by sniper fire from a church bell tower that, according to the reference document for this script drawing on military history accounts, he physically scaled the tower himself and demanded 15 loaded muskets be brought to him to personally return fire. At that moment, a Spanish cannonball decapitated Captain Lepeau, who was standing directly beside him. During the assault on the Portillo Gate, the Spanish artillery battery that was holding the breach was silenced. The gunners killed by French fire. As the French infantry column advanced to exploit the undefended position, a young woman stepped forward from among the civilians watching the defense. The reference document for this script identifies her as Agustina de Aragon, approximately 22 years old, a civilian. She crossed to the battery, took the line stock, the firing device the dead gunners had dropped, and fired a loaded 24-pound cannon point blank into the advancing French column. The assault broke. The breach held. Agustina de Aragon, her actions documented in multiple contemporary accounts and preserved in the historical record with considerable consistency, became the most recognizable symbol of Spanish civilian resistance in the entire war. She survived Zaragoza, was later captured by the French, escaped, and eventually served in Wellington's army as the only female commissioned officer in his force. She married after the war and died at approximately 71 years of age in Ceuta. Her remains were eventually moved to the Church of Our Lady of the Pillar in Zaragoza, the city she had helped defend with a cannon she didn't know how to operate. Zaragoza capitulated on February 20th, 1809. Over 50,000 defenders and civilians had died, the majority from a typhus epidemic that spread through the overcrowded, devastated city. The resistance had delayed French pacification of Aragon for months and consumed resources that might have been decisive elsewhere. The Battle of Albuera on May 16, 1811, produced a different kind of documented individual courage. At one of the most intense close-range musketry engagements of the entire Napoleonic Wars. War history online documents that British officer casualties at Albuera ran to 39% of those who took the field. Colonel William Inglis of the 57th Regiment of Foot was struck in the neck and back by French canister shot, unable to be evacuated. Lying beneath the regimental colors, Inglis continuously called to his disintegrating ranks, "Die hard, 57th, die hard." The regiment held its position. The nickname passed into permanent British military tradition. The 57th were the diehards from that day. The name survives. These individuals, Agustina at her cannon, Inglis beneath his colors, the unnamed gunners of Zaragoza over whose bodies Agustina stepped, are what the aggregate statistics represent. 250,000 French dead is a number. The 50,000 in Zaragoza is a number. The 4,670 Allied casualties at Badajoz is a number. These numbers are accurate, as accurately as historical sources allow. They are also human beings, each of whom died in a specific place at a specific moment, for reasons that had begun with a child's cry at a palace gate. After Vitoria, the war contracted geographically, even as its intensity remained. Marshal Nicolas Soult, reassigned by Napoleon to command the battered remnants of French forces in the peninsula after Jourdan's failure, was arguably the most capable operational commander the French had left. He conducted the rearguard actions through the Pyrenees and into France, with the skill of a man who understood that his task was not victory, but controlled withdrawal. At Sorarin on July 28, 1813, Soult launched a counteroffensive, hoping to relieve the French garrisons at Pamplona and San Sebastian, which Wellington's forces had besieged during the initial advance. The counter-offensive achieved early success in the passes of Mayo and Roncesvalles before Allied resistance stiffened. Soult abandoned the operation on July 30th and withdrew toward France. At the Bidassoa on October 7th, at the Nivelle on November 10th, and across the extended fighting at the Nive in December, where French casualties over the multi-day engagement ran to approximately 7,000, according to the 1944 Review's account. Soult contested every yard. He was consistently unable to reverse the strategic direction of the war, but he was making Wellington pay for every mile into France. Wellington's campaign continued into 1814. He defeated Soult at Orthez on February 27th. He advanced on Toulouse, where Soult had established his final defensive position, and attacked on April 10th. The fighting was intense across the city's outer defenses. Allied casualties ran to approximately 4,600, French to approximately 3,200. Soult withdrew that night. Wellington entered Toulouse on April 12, 1814. Then news arrived that Napoleon had abdicated on April 6th, 4 days before the Battle of Toulouse. The last major engagement of the Peninsular War had been fought after the war was over. This postscript has a grimmer addendum. General Pierre Touvenot, commanding the French garrison at Bayonne, launched a sortie against Allied forces on April 14th, 8 days after Napoleon's abdication, with the news spreading rapidly across France. War History Online notes that Touvenot was widely condemned as having caused a wasteful and pointless loss of life. Men died at Bayonne because a garrison commander had not received or would not accept information that his emperor had surrendered. It is the kind of detail that resists the narrative conventions of military history, which prefer endings that correspond to the moment of decision rather than the moment of information reaching everyone the decision affected. The fates of the principal figures divide cleanly along lines of success and failure. Wellington became the first Duke of Wellington, celebrated across Europe as the man who had broken Napoleon's peninsular empire. He served twice as British Prime Minister. He died in September 1852 at the age of 83. His funeral, attended by crowds in London that contemporary accounts describe as the largest gathering since Nelson's. Marshal Soult, his most formidable adversary in the final campaigns, underwent a political transformation remarkable enough to constitute its own historical curiosity. He eventually served as Prime Minister of France under Louis Philippe between 1832 and 1847, at various points, having spent the first years of the Restoration exiled and his title stripped. Joseph Bonaparte settled in the United States, specifically in Bordentown, New Jersey, where he spent decades in comfortable American exile before dying in 1844. Marshal Massena died in Paris in 1817, his reputation permanently damaged by the Portuguese failure. Ferdinand VII, who had destroyed the constitution written in his name and persecuted the people who had saved his throne, died in 1833 after a reign characterized by his contemporaries as among the most reactionary in Spanish history. Every counterinsurgency manual written since 1808 contains, in some form, the lessons encoded in the mountains of Spain. This is not metaphor. Military academies that train officers to conduct or counter irregular warfare draw on the Peninsular War, because the fundamental dynamics of that conflict, the asymmetries of information, the limits of conventional military superiority against motivated civilian populations, the self-defeating consequences of disproportionate reprisal, have not changed in the intervening 2 centuries. Technology has changed. The human dynamics have not. The first lesson is terrain and intelligence as force multipliers. Wellington used the geography of Portugal and Spain to negate French numerical advantages systematically. The Torres Vedras lines channeled any French advance into prepared killing zones. The guerrilla network provided intelligence that made French operational planning nearly impossible. Modern military doctrine codifies this principle under the concept of information dominance, the ability of one side to understand the operational environment while denying that understanding to the other. The Spanish achieved information dominance against the finest army in Europe, with no technology beyond human relationships and local knowledge. The French were fighting blind in a country where everyone they encountered knew exactly where they were. The second lesson is the strategic cost of alienating a civilian population. Wellington's systematic policy of paying for supplies in hard currency, documented across multiple sources as a deliberate strategic choice, not merely administrative regularity, maintained Portuguese and Spanish civilian cooperation across 6 years of war. The French foraging system, which treated occupied territory as a resource to be consumed rather than a population to be managed, created enemies faster than it fed soldiers. Every Portuguese farmer whose livestock was seized by Massena's foragers was a potential informant for the guerrilla network the French were simultaneously trying to destroy. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing, and by the time French commanders recognized it, irreversible. The third lesson is the limits of conventional military superiority against distributed, decentralized insurgency. Napoleon had the finest professional army in European history. He had artillery the Spanish could not match, cavalry the guerrillas could not face in open country, logistics systems the juntas could not replicate, and generals who had defeated every conventional opponent they had faced. None of this mattered against people who wouldn't fight on his terms. The Spanish guerrillas were individually and collectively beatable in any engagement that occurred on French terms. They simply refused to engage on French terms. Every French victory over a guerrilla band was tactically irrelevant because the band reconstituted from the civilian population that had supplied and sheltered it. Clausewitz identified this mechanism while studying the Spanish insurgency, and it became the foundation of his concept of the people in arms. The theoretical framework that underlies modern understandings of total war. The Prussian philosopher of conflict was building his most important intellectual contribution on lessons learned in Spain. The fourth and deepest lesson, and the one Napoleon himself identified on St. Helena, is the psychology of strategic overconfidence. He had been right about Spain in 1795. Ronald Fraser, in his 2008 study, Napoleon's Cursed War, documents that Napoleon had written privately that a land war in Spain was unwinnable because of the popular resistance it would generate. 13 years and the conquest of Europe later, he invaded anyway. The question this raises about what success does to strategic judgment, about how the repeated confirmation of capability hardens into the assumption of limitlessness, is not merely historical. It recurs. It recurred in the American military's assessment of Iraq in 2003. It recurred in the Soviet assessment of Afghanistan in 1979. It recurs whenever an institution has been right about so many things for so long that it loses the capacity to genuinely hear the internal voice that warns it could be wrong about this one. Dara, from the reference script that informed this video's approach, demonstrates that geometry can defeat numbers. Spain demonstrates something harder to codify, that geography, culture, and the absolute human refusal to accept defeat can defeat everything else. Ask 100 people to name a Napoleonic battle. They will say Waterloo. Many will say Trafalgar. Some will say Austerlitz. Almost none will say Bailen, or Salamanca, or Vitoria. The battles that actually broke Napoleon's empire from the inside. The obscurity is not accidental, and it is not simply a matter of the Peninsular War being less dramatic than its reputation deserves. It is the product of specific structural features of how wars are remembered. Features that the Peninsular War failed in almost every category. The source problem is real, but manageable. Sir Charles Oman's 7-volume A History of the Peninsular War, completed between 1902 and 1930, remains the definitive scholarly account of military operations. Charles S. Dale's 2001 single-volume study provides the leading modern synthesis. David Gates's The Spanish Ulcer, 1986, a title drawn directly from Napoleon's own terminology, was called a major achievement by Oxford military historian Michael Howard in a judgment documented in publisher reviews and subsequently cited consistently across scholarship on the war. The scholarship exists. It is substantial and high quality. The problem is not absence of sources, it is absence of popular narrative. The narrative problem is structural. The Peninsular War has no single climactic moment. Bailen broke the myth of French invincibility in 1808, but Napoleon personally reversed the consequences within months. Torres Vedras stopped Massena in 1810, but the war continued for 3 more years. Salamanca liberated Madrid in 1812, but Wellington was forced to retreat from Burgos later the same year and abandon Madrid again. Vitoria ended French control of Spain in 1813, but the fighting continued until Napoleon's abdication in April 1814. A war that ends through attrition rather than a single definitive engagement resists the narrative compression that popular memory requires. There is no Waterloo moment in the Peninsular War, no single afternoon that contains the entire arc of the conflict. The Spanish problem compounds the structural one. The war's largest contributor, Spain itself, which by the scholarly evidence may have inflicted approximately 3/4 of French casualties, emerged from the conflict too politically fractured to celebrate what it had done. Ferdinand VII's persecution of the liberals who had governed in his name meant there was no continuous Spanish national narrative of the war's meaning. The people who would have written that narrative were in prison or exile within weeks of the victory being secured. A triumph without a triumphalist narrative fades. The Wellington problem distorts the English language memory that might otherwise have preserved the war's complexity. Wellington is a genuinely important figure. His campaigns were brilliantly executed, his logistics management unprecedented in British military history, his understanding of terrain and coalition management exceptional. But the English language historical tradition that celebrates him has consistently, as the Goodreads review of Gates's study notes, understated the contribution of the Spanish regular armies and the guerrilla insurgency that bled France far more than any British force. The rediscovery has come, appropriately, through military practitioners rather than popular historians. After Afghanistan and Iraq, conflicts that demonstrated the same basic dynamics the Spanish insurgency had demonstrated 200 years earlier, military academies returned to the Peninsular War with renewed interest. The war that most people cannot locate on a historical timeline turns out to have been the first modern war. The first conflict in which a technologically and organizationally superior conventional force was systematically defeated by a population that refused to acknowledge the conventions of conventional defeat. The battlefield of Bailen is in Jaén province in southern Spain. A small museum commemorates the engagement where the French myth was first broken. The ruins of the lines of Torres Vedras, north of Lisbon, are partially preserved and accessible to visitors, designated as a National Heritage Site by the Portuguese government in March 2019. No major monument marks the ground where Massena's army starved. The war that changed the world's military vocabulary left very few monuments. That unfortunate war destroyed me. The words are documented across multiple independent sources: the Napoleon.org academic site, the National Endowment for the Humanities account, the Counterfire review of Ronald Fraser's study, the 1944 review's analysis. They appear consistently attributed to Napoleon's St. Helena memoirs, dictated to his companions during the 6 years between his final exile in 1815 and his death on May 5, 1821. The man who had conquered Europe, who had redrawn its maps and installed his family on its thrones, who had made his name synonymous with military genius, spent his final years returning obsessively not to Waterloo, but to Spain. It divided my forces, multiplied my obligations, undermined my morale. He continued in the same passage. All the circumstances of my disasters are bound up in that fatal knot. He also called Spain the Spanish wasp's nest. Elsewhere in his St. Helena reflections, documented in the Counterfire review of Fraser's work, he described that cursed war with Spain as the main cause of France's misfortunes. The consistency of the attribution, Spain, not Russia, Spain, not the continental system's failure, Spain, not Waterloo, suggests something more than tactical retrospection. Napoleon was identifying a mechanism, a place where the logic of his own success had finally, fatally, turned against him. The mechanism is documented in the historical record that Ronald Fraser's 2008 study, Napoleon's Cursed War, drew on. Napoleon had written privately in 1795, as a young general, that a land war in Spain was unwinnable because of the popular resistance it would generate. The exact wording of the private correspondence varies across citations, but the substance is consistent across scholars who have examined it. He knew, as a young officer before the conquests had begun, that Spain was different. He wrote it down. Then he spent 13 years winning everything else. And somewhere in those victories, the warning he had written to himself was buried under the accumulated evidence of his own invincibility. This is the psychological mystery that no military analysis fully resolves. It is not unique to Napoleon. The pattern of success corrupting strategic judgment appears repeatedly in military history. But it is uniquely documented in his case. A man who explicitly predicted his own Spanish disaster, and then, 13 years later, enacted it. The French archives document every decision he made. They do not explain the one moment, somewhere between 1795 and 1808, when he stopped being able to hear the part of his own intelligence that had been right. Wellington met Napoleon once after the wars were over, at a diplomatic reception in Paris in 1815, following Napoleon's second abdication. Wellington's subsequent account of the meeting, documented in his biographical sources, described Napoleon's attempt to dominate the conversation through anecdotes and self-presentation. Wellington was unimpressed. He later described Napoleon in a statement that appears across multiple biographical sources with consistent substance, if varying exact wording, as the most extraordinary combination of qualities I ever saw in any man. Magnificent in the field, impossible in council. Spain had not made Napoleon impossible in the field. He remained, in the final campaigns of 1814, a tactical genius capable of winning battles with improvised forces against overwhelming odds. Spain had made him impossible in council, had extended his strategic commitments beyond the capacity of any single intelligence to manage, had consumed the reserve that would have absorbed disaster elsewhere, had demonstrated to Europe that the inevitable was contingent and the invincible was mortal. The contradiction at the center of Napoleon's Spanish failure, knowing and doing anyway, is perhaps the most human thing documented about him. He was not a man of limited self-understanding. He was a man who understood himself very well, and then discovered that self-understanding is not the same as self-control. The victories between 1795 and 1808 had not taught him that he was invincible. They had created in him a disposition toward action that operated faster than his own analysis, a habit of solving problems through force that had worked so reliably it had begun to function as instinct rather than calculation. Spain was not a problem that responded to force. He knew this. He invaded anyway. And on an island in the South Atlantic, with time finally available for the reflection that conquest had precluded, he admitted what it had cost. We began with a child's cry, one frightened moment at a palace gate in May 1808, that a crowd transformed into an insurrection and an insurrection transformed into 6 years of war. The accounting that followed is documented in historical records that span 7-volume scholarly histories, contemporary military dispatches, Goya's 82 etchings, 2 paintings in the Prado, a silver chamber pot still used at regimental dinners, and Napoleon's own memoirs written in the last years of an exile he attributed, more than to anything else, to Spain. Historian Charles S. Dial estimates French dead approaching 250,000 men. Wikipedia's Napoleonic Wars article documents at minimum 91,000 killed in action and 237,000 wounded. 60 major battles, 30 major sieges, 6 years across 19 Spanish and 6 Portuguese provinces, and then into France itself, with the last major battle fought 4 days after the emperor had already abdicated. The word guerrilla, born in these mountains, from people who had never read a military manual, is now in every military doctrine on earth. Karl von Clausewitz built his theoretical framework for understanding total war, partly from studying what happened in Spain. The constitution drafted inside besieged Cadiz became the template for liberal constitutions across Europe and Latin America. Even after the king, it was written to restore, immediately destroyed it. The guerrillas fought with hunting knives, axes, and complete refusal to accept that losing battles meant losing wars. Agustina de Aragon stepped over the bodies of dead gunners and fired a cannon she didn't know how to load. Colonel Inglis lay under his colors with canister shot in his neck, calling to his regiment to die hard. 2 mayors in a small town signed a declaration of war from a post office. And they all, in their different ways, did something Napoleon had spent 13 years growing unable to do. They heard the warning, recognized the reality, and acted on what they knew rather than what they wished. The Spanish ulcer had no cure. Not because Spain was invincible, it was not, and the historical record documents its defeats comprehensively. Not because Wellington was infallible, he wasn't. And Burgos and the Sintra Inquiry and various other failures document this clearly. But because the people of Spain, poor, devoutly Catholic, fiercely regional, magnificently and comprehensively stubborn, had decided they would not be governed by a Bonaparte. And no army on earth, however brilliantly commanded, however numerically superior, however professionally trained, has ever found an adequate military answer to a population that has made that decision with genuine unanimity and maintained it for 6 years. Napoleon named what Spain did to him. He called it an ulcer because ulcers bleed without healing, consuming the body that carries them without the body being able to identify the moment when the blood loss became fatal. He was right about the metaphor. He had been right in 1795 about everything that followed. The tragedy, his tragedy, and the tragedy of the 250,000 men who died for it, was not that he didn't know. It was that he invaded anyway. Sometimes the most important military history is not the history of the battles that were won. It is the history of the warnings that were heard, understood completely, and then ignored. And